Welcome to the Dragonfly Rising podcast. I am your host, Dr. Tami Dean. Thank you for joining me today as we continue to work together to make a difference. Let's explore how we can use our voice today. Welcome to another episode of the Dragonfly Rising podcast with me, Dr. Tami Dean, your host, and I am so excited for our guests today. We have Dr. JaNiece Elzy Palmer with us today. Dr. Elzy Palmer is an assistant professor at Texas Woman's University in Denton, Texas. So she is joining us to share some of her amazing research that she's been doing and how that impacts and affects students. As you know, we always love our guests to share a little bit about their equity journey and what that's looked like for you, that's gotten you to the space you are in today. So tell me a little bit about your equity journey.
Yes. Well, I think I was thinking about this question as I've been listening to other episodes of this great and wonderful podcast. And I was thinking it all starts back to when I was a classroom teacher. I was a classroom teacher in a school district in Illinois that the population was changing very rapidly. So this was around 2006, and it was moving from a predominantly white, maybe upper middle class, socioeconomic status area to one that was becoming very much more so multicultural. There were 22 languages spoken at the school when I was there.
Wow.
And it was an elementary school, K-5. And so you can imagine this, that teachers had to make. But, as I'm thinking about it, there wasn't any professional development or anything from our administrators or from the district that really helped teachers to understand, as you can imagine, the demographics of the teachers represented much like they are right now, where there was maybe one of two teachers of color and all the other teachers were elementary school white women. And so a lot of them had been there for a long time. They've grown up in the community. Some of them had even gone to the school, and so it was, as things are changing, the teachers aren't quite keeping up with it and the district isn't either. And there were policies, I remember, especially with multilingual learners, that I just thought to myself, this is kind of a civil rights issue almost, being placed in dual language programs and then taken out of the dual language programs and then put back in monolingual programs and being up with the assessment like language has nothing to do with literacy, and so they were being
crazy concept.
Placement interventions, they're, even on RTI, okay, well, they're not showing progress there in special education. And I remember later on, they'd be like, I was in this district for 10 years. So I would say probably year 8, or I would say, I wonder what's the percentage of multilingual students in special education are being qualified right now? 63%.
Oh my gosh.
That were in that district were multilingual placed in special education or on the pipeline for special education and interventions. And they made up probably about 13 or 14% of the district population. And so there was a huge discrepancy. And that is what sparked me to actually go and get my doctoral degree. Which is I got to do something about this. Because, how is this equitable at all for these and our expectations that did not match? So I remember when I was a classroom teacher, I had so many students that spoke so many different languages and I didn't have the education. My education preparation program did not have any linguistics classes, did not talk about language as a picture or, helping students to become literate. And I remember one of the local universities had a workshop for L1 and L2. And I spent my own money. I was like, I'm paying this $250.
Yeah.
I've always been kind of that teacher that was, really in externally driven. I do right by the students. There was something, in that experience that really didn't sit well with me. And that was really the start of my journey. As you can imagine, when I started my PhD program and I started learning about language theories and other literacy theories, my mind was open to much more that I could be doing to be culturally and linguistically responsive to the students that were in front of me. And so, yeah, that's been my journey ever since.
Wow. When you think about the disproportionality of
Mm,
identification with students, and I think that's a really good point, right? Because oftentimes when we hear about over identification of students, people tend to think of like behavior and other types of disproportionality that exist. But I think this is a key point. And, your eyes are open. I think that's the thing about an equity journey, right? Once your
yeah,
eyes are open and you see this one nugget, you start to see how it connects to the other components around systems of inequity that exist in schools. So, I just think that's so compelling, right? So you decide to go get your doctorate, right? And I think that's that's amazing, right? Because you now have the opportunity in what you do now to influence and support practicing teachers and future teachers, right? So to try to influence in ways that you didn't necessarily have the opportunity to have in your own kind of journey. So I think that's a really, really powerful move. So I love that, you went right into the culturally and linguistically responsive teaching. Imagine that. Imagine that. I know you've been doing a lot of work in thinking about how we think about language and the ways of communication that students bring to the classroom and those implications of those perceptions on students and in their learning environment. So I would love to just hear a little bit about your work and what you've been kind of diving into with teachers out in the field and what they're doing.
absolutely. And so, yes, I have definitely been very focused on language, and it's taken its, turns here and there, but really the core question that I think always come back to centers around our literacy assessment. And, the field of literacy research hasn't really dealt with linguistic diversity a lot. So the field of sociolinguistics has, but not literacy. And so literacy has been kind of like in this ideologically neutral bubble. Like, assessments and our practices, it's like as long as we're teaching reading, that's just really where it centers. And so, especially literacy, I think, has been in that method fetish of like, we need to just find the right literacy method, regardless of our students' cultural context or social context. And I think when we do that, it really leaves us blinded or it hides, the other factors that are very are really largely contributing to maybe other reasons why students may be scoring certain ways on assessment. One of the things we know that's been getting a lot of attention lately, especially with in the emergent bilingual community, is our literacy assessments are very geared, or even not geared, the underpinnings are from a monolingual framework. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
we're using our monolingual framework to really understand literacy, but we're using that on students that are linguistically diverse. That really I started really being interested in that when I was listening to a student that was African American and spoke like African American English or Black English. And as he was reading, and this was a student that was years old. So, he was labeled a struggling reader. And then also, was in that acquisition phase,
Mm-hmm.
at
Right.
kindergarten.
Right.
And so, when we think about like how long students have been talking and speaking in their community, language development, it's like, we understand that to be that, of course, students will, speak the language that they speak at home when they come to school, but we're having them read these texts and then use them to engage, whether they have a literacy issue or not. And we're taking the language piece out of it. The assessment that the teacher was giving the student was a running record.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought in my research, it would be really good to examine that because in the field of literacy research, we often think of the running record as like the assessment that it's really going to help us understand, like
Right.
what readers are doing. But what I found is that if we don't analyze the assessment with the eye for linguistic diversity, we end up inadvertently replicating the same inequities as other assessments that have been really labeled as standard, like standardized assessments, for
Right.
example,
Right.
like,
Mm-hmm.
right, as like not ethical. And so, but that can be also done with the running record, especially if there's no interrogation around it. And what I found is that there's been very little research around this. And so when I remember working with the student and the teacher that was analyzing the running record, and we both said, some of the things like the student was doing was the teacher was an African American teacher. I'm an African American woman. And so all three of us speak Black English. And we were all like, well, yeah, we understand why he said, let that S off the end. So it was like, instead of the frog, he was saying, the frog. And instead of like the bird. So everything else was decoded and read fluently, but like the plurals were left off. And maybe there might have been some other subject verb disagreements that are very difficult. And so because we're familiar with it, we were like, oh, yeah, well, we can understand why the student would do that. And we kind of didn't think anything of it, except for she said, well, if I counted up all these errors, then technically he's failed.
Right.
This, and there was really no guidance. I started thinking like, well, yeah, but like, we're not just going to analyze by thinking about the accuracy score, but it's very clear in our functional assessments or developmental reading assessments, the guided reading assessment, all of those assessments are very clear in the directions when they say, if the student does not have this accuracy score, then you go down a level. And so I started wrestling with, is this really significant though of a literacy? Is this a reading issue? Or is this somehow a play of how language intersects with literacy, especially at that acquisition phase when students are drawing on what they know about language and they're drawing on their language resources to help them understand language in the printed form. This is a newly printed form. So I'm trying to understand this and grapple with this. And I'm trying to negotiate the differences between my spoken language and what's here that my eyes are picking up. And so it makes sense that language would intersect with literacy acquisition in very complex ways. But the assessment as the directions were written didn't really allow for that complexity. And so that's really where my research is headed. I want to understand how teachers are interpreting these things and how we can then make our assessment and not just our, analyzing of the assessment, but how that then impacts our instructional practices. Because I myself, as I was hosting this teacher, I was like, well, do I tell her just ignore the direction? I wasn't sure what to do. And there was not a lot of guidance. And so I said, I think this is something that we really need to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I want to come back to something you were talking about, like interrogating the results, right? And to me, this makes me think of the opportunity for professionalism and knowledge, but how are we learning about this? Because I can see threads of this expectation from, a student has an oral language that has certain systems and structures, right? And then that gets connected with how it flows when they're reading, not necessarily an error that they're not noticing the S, right? But it's just a part of way of their knowing and being and understanding. But then you see that transferred, right, into this instruction you're talking about, not just the literacy assessment itself, but then how do we value language in the classroom kind of period, right? And like the linguistic diversity that exists with language.
Yeah. And that really, what it is the heart of what my work that I am really attempting to investigate is how teachers are right, not just analyzing the assessment, but how do I take the results that I'm getting? What am I noticing about it? What does that mean for me, for my instruction, for how I interact with the child? Am I going to, what I have found, if I can jump to that a little bit,
Yeah.
that pilot study that the teachers absolutely noticed it. They were not blind to the link. They were like, oh yeah, this definitely seems consistent with the way that the students speak. But that's where it ended. They had no idea what to do after that. And so they kind of went business as usual. They went, okay, I'm just gonna do the standard procedures and the standard practices, and that's what I'm going to do because I really don't know what else to do. No one really has going to be any guidance about this. And yeah, I can definitely see that this is something that is, I don't want to say impacting the student's accuracy score, but what do I do with it?
Right. It's influencing it, right? And we know that that's an influence on it. Wow. So what really is at play? This what's right is or what's necessary, or it seems to be a disruption of systems that perpetuate inequities in how we understand difference in our classroom.
Yeah, a complete, I would say, disruption and a complete disassembly. I kind of am really starting to think as the more teachers that I talk to, it's like, is there something about the way that we understand Black English and Black language, is something that it's not something that I want to hold on to that's different from like a child's main language as their first language, like Spanish or Chinese or Vietnamese. And that's where I really have to translanguaging as a theoretical framework that offers us a lens to help us understand why the disruption and the complete dismantling is necessary. Because what language offers us, or languaging theory says, is that this whole thing about like our borders and named languages, like these are all socially constructed. Language is a fluid, living, breathing thing. And somehow, who says what, there is no rules about what's appropriate language or not. We create those things. And so we can totally say, you know what, this is appropriate. This is okay. And if we have a whole community of people that have been, speaking this language in their home, then it's completely valid. Not even getting to the point of that, it has grammatical structures and rules. Like, it's not like everything just goes out right now. Consistencies and things like that. Just a whole nother can of worms. But, teachers, especially if they are in the community, speaking with the students and really getting to know the importance of the language and what it means for the students' identities, they're really left, not knowing. And so the thought there is like, this is what needs to happen in order for them to be, at the test. And so it doesn't matter if, the student identities are erased here. It doesn't matter if the home language isn't the same. Dr. April Baker Bell says that, in the multilingual community, it is often suggested that, you know, our practices in the classroom need to sustain home languages, but that Black students aren't afforded that,
Right.
and so there is also this intersection that makes it really complex of like, our societal views of language, which languages are worthy of our assessment accommodations and our assessment dismantling and our assessment disruption, or which languages aren't necessary or necessarily seen as like, oh, this language needs to be sustained. And so I'm going to really put effort into interrogating and analyzing my instruction and my assessments and making sure that my comments about it, how I'm really digging in on that's not sending the wrong message to the student, is that something, is this language worthy of that? Is another layer, I think, to the research and investigation that I'm just starting to really grapple with.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like that's going to touch a nerve a little bit, right? Because couple pieces of this, right? One, that all of these languages are, there's value here, but having to see, right? Because in my mind, I see the parallel between the social construct of race itself and that
Mm-hmm.
hierarchy, and then the
Mm-hmm.
social construct of which language is valued, right? And for me, this all comes back to the power, who who has the power in the systems. And I know people like to think that schools are these very neutral spaces, but they aren't, which I know you know this, but they aren't, because schools exist within the larger social system that's already in place. And it just perpetuates these inequities and systems and structures that have been in place to continue to marginalize certain groups of people. But
Absolutely.
and I think it's really powerful, right? Like, your bilingualism, that's real bilingualism, right? I feel like
Right.
this one's not. This one is, and I'm just going to say this because I've heard this in my own, work, like, that's lazy. That's,
Yeah.
very negative, derogative terms associated with other languages. I mean,
And I often say when someone has asked me, like, what's your goal? What would you like teachers, if they pick up your piece of research, what would you like them to do? And something you said really touched on that. I said, I would like them to just pause and think, is this bothering my ear to hear this? And why? Why is
mm,
that bothering my ear?
mm, yes, the pause and
The pause.
reflect.
Yeah. The pause
That,
and reflect. Yeah.
yeah, like, to me, that connects to an awareness of self and being able to understand or think about how your own bias influences your interaction or understanding, or maybe lack thereof, of another person and their experience.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. And I think I want to put this out there too, because I think it happens inadvertently.
Mm-hmm.
Especially like I said, when we're thinking about literacy research and the field of literacy research, it really, the assessments and our practices, we're just now getting to the point where we are really calling out, in this field, like some of the inequitable practices that have been long standing.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
are just inadvertently perpetuating the same systems that we see of inequality and marginalization in society.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really do think that I think it's time for the field to really address this.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a wondering, and I don't know if you've thought about this or addressed this at all in your research or in your conversations with teachers, but you mentioned the compliance around the way in which the assessment is given, and that it really requires a more of a complex view of it. But I also see this need butting up with some current climate we have in education right now, where I feel like the pendulum is swinging to this very compliance based experience for educators where they aren't provided the professional latitude to best meet the needs of the students in front of them. So I'm curious if you've seen that in your conversations with teachers, or what your thoughts are about that as it kind of connects with your work.
Yeah, that's good. I haven't thought of it in that way, but I can definitely see your connection. Um, one of the I did ask, I remembered in an interview with one teacher in the research study, and I asked him just like, do you feel like you have the authority to, say, I'm going to analyze it in this way. I know that the book says to do this, but I'm going to make a different place. And he said, kind of, but my thing is like, I know that when this kid goes to a different classroom or they're in other spaces, they're not going to be afforded that. So it's almost like he felt like it was his duty, almost like to prepare kids for the real world, So we hear that, like, well, I know they're going to be judged, or I know that they're going to be held to that hard, fast standard. So it's my job to kind of do that as well. And so there was kind of this whole idea that, but is it my job to spin in equity, or is it my job to call into question period? But it's my job to kind of like continue on and just help the kids to assimilate and help the kids to then move their language practices, not necessarily it's up to the assessment to assimilate to the needs of the students. And so I think that view for sure is there. I do think the climate isn't helping. The current doesn't that because definitely is also like a fear, of do the wrong thing. I don't want to go against the grain.
I don't want to get fired.
Yeah, absolutely. And in my courses, I see that a lot more. Just yesterday, I teach a comprehension class, and the teacher was like, "Oh yeah, I mean, like this is good in theory, but I know that my assessment director is going to say to me, what are this number of students scoring, this way? Why do you have this number of students getting this question wrong? And that kind of thing without interrogating like the assessment. So, she was also saying like, hey, I get what you're saying, but at the end of the day, it's going to be my job. They're going to be coming and looking at me and saying, I'm just preparing students to do well. And so I think it's very hard. There wasn't a teacher that when we talked and analyzed and we talked about the research, we talked about the assessment, there wasn't a single teacher I've talked to that was like, oh no, I'm not gonna do that. They wanted to do well. It's hard. I want to make sure that I'm also saying I don't think that teachers were actively, intentionally saying I'm going to do wrong by this kid. I'm seeing what you're saying, but anyway, it was definitely a very complex. And I know they wanted to write, but yeah, as you're saying, this climate of it's a very assessment driven culture in education, right? And a particular version of assessment. I should like assessment to like the very empiricism, not self-assessment, assessment for learning. It's like,
Authentic assessment. And I think that's a really good point, right? That there's a tension. And I feel that tension with teachers too in the field, right? There's a tension between how do I do what I know is best for a student and still meet this compliance expectation for me, like this push and pull with where do I maybe have more authority, right, to push back on some of these systems. But I wonder if we start thinking about it differently. And this just came to my mind, right? So we talk a lot about allyship. And if you're the person with power in an equity situation, right? How do you step into your power and authority to be an ally to the person that doesn't have that power in that situation? And if we think about this, we have an opportunity as educators to be allies for the students.
Absolutely.
And,
Absolutely.
and I think and I'm not saying it's an easy decision and process to make, but I think if maybe as an educator, if you start thinking, maybe what's the one thing I can do to help me be a better ally to these students that I know aren't being served well with how we're looking at assessment data or how we're utilizing this assessment, right? And maybe you don't have an opportunity to change that actual assessment at this point, but maybe there's another way to bring in that allyship. Like, let's talk about an asset perspective of this student to combine with this number that exists versus prioritizing a number in the way that we have.
Mm-hmm. Like, what do I know about the student? It's not just like they're leaving off and like you said, oh, that adds, or they're saying looking instead of looking and things like that. So what do I know about it? Comes into play here. Like, what do I know about their home and their language? Like, these are, like, as we were talking about full circle at the beginning, like the ways in which language intersects and interacts with literacy is so complex. I think if we can't just ignore it as it has been without it having and of the students that are already marginalized in oppressed society. And so I like the idea of like, what's that one thing I can do? I really do think that, and even if the one thing I can do is to take into consideration what I know about the student, how school, their home, their family, their language that they speak. You know what I mean? These are all things that should be taken into consideration. You know, that score is not devoid of those things. And I like that. I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah. Yeah. And I always think of the irony of saying, like, we're preparing the kids for the real world. The real world is actually culturally and linguistically diverse.
Absolutely.
It's not monolingual.
So, and I think about these literacy researchers, I would say the grandmother of culturally responsive teaching, Gloria Ladson-Billy. I was listening to her talk very recently, and she was now in her Black English. So that said something about the person that was introducing her said something about how the section was going to be, was coordinated. And she said, we're going to give us some time to circulate and things like that. So Gloria Ladson-Billy gets up there out there about this, when I hear the word circulate, and what you're thinking, I'm thinking the sound and people have that monitoring, like we're so trained to do, like, oh, in the real world, you're going to have to do this. Like, she's being honored with like a lifetime achievement award for her research. And she's back speaking in our home language, like English. And I think, like, I even think about myself in that manner. I always say, like, oh, I want to do that. Like, I'm going to be like that, and when I'm teaching, I'm going to throw it to the wayside and I'm just going to speak like how I speak at home. And man, I've just been so conditioned, Dr. Tami D. My brain has been so conditioned already, to say like, well, in these cases, this is what you do. You need to turn it off, and I just love people that are, getting lifetime achievement award for their research and their scholarship, that have really been, huge. Like we stand on the shoulders of these people and she's up there speaking. Just like how she speaks, she's not having to wait that you talk about prepare for the real world.
Yeah.
I realized I talked about someone that is the epitome of demonstrating that, this language is just a part of us and our community and it has nothing to do with intelligence or laziness and the ways that it has been perpetuated in society of, not being valued, like being valued in many ways. So, I like to show that in my class when we talk about linguistic diversity, is just so that people can see, hey, this article that you read by this person that you were like, oh yeah, I love this scholarship that's been widely published, so many books. This is her talking.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes me think about showing up as our true selves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And come back to like representation matters, right? Because here is Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings showing up as her true self, right? And if we take, I'm going to call it taking back our power, right? Take back our power to show up as our true self. How can that maybe shift the opportunity for those coming behind us to have more open space to sit there in their authentic self?
Yeah. And I think, and when I have shown that video, we're talking about, just multilingualism being inclusive of all language, not just our nation state names. Languages that have been constructed, students that speak Spanish have said like that empowered them, to, be more, empowering them to like own it, and empowering them to like not have to feel like I have to speak a certain type of English, when I am in class. And so I think about how when we show up as our true selves, as you said, like it's not just for the students that speaking Black English, it's all of our students that have been marginalized because of the language and the languages and the ways that they language, I should say, in spaces.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's where the power is, right? Like sometimes we think we don't have the power to influence change, right? But if we think about how change has happened over time, it always starts with like one person doing what they can do. And then that multiplies by these other people, right? So even if it feels like you don't have the power for change, you do, because you have control, right, over your own circle of influence, right? And that spreads to other people that are connected to that circle of influence. That's how I like to think about it. I don't know if you think about it the same way.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And I think about like that. Yeah, those teachers that are like, wow, I didn't think about it that way. And, that has really empowered me. Now they go out, like you said, yeah, in that circle. And now they are empowering someone else by showing up as their authentic selves. And that's exactly how they, that, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. So I think this is a really great spot. Like, I think we've already been kind of sharing some tips, but I really want to think about your research in particular and thinking about, a tip to share for educators. Like what would be something you'd want and share with them about how they can use their voice, how they can think about being culturally and linguistically responsive in their educational settings, even leaders, right? How do they set up an environment to support their teachers with being culturally and linguistically responsive? I would love to hear kind of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, my biggest thing that I for teachers, especially when they're thinking about assessment, is to think about the assessment in a very holistic way. There's lots of research out there with, again, immersion bilingual students, but also how that applies to all students that are multilingual in the ways in which their language practices are going to intersect with their literacy practices. And to not only, I will say, I talked about the pause, but not only the pause, but really coming back to that question of who is bearing the responsibility to change here? So if I am expecting my students that are learning about print and learning about language to really embrace this idea of reading and that love of reading and how it can be representative of their language and language practices, then the burden of change isn't on them. But if we don't interrogate, we just take it for, face value. If we don't start interrogating the assessment, is this assessment really showing what I know that my students can do? Is this a reading issue, or is this assessment not designed in a way to allow for the complexity of language and literacy? And if it's not, then the burden is on us to do something about it, not on the student to then accommodate and change. And so I think just asking yourself that question, like as I'm analyzing, as I'm interpreting, as I'm thinking about my instruction as a whole, like who is carrying the burden of change?
Oh, that's a great question. Because do we really want to, should we be putting that on the back of 6-year-old children?
Yeah, exactly. No, I don't think so.
I mean, I just think that's a really powerful way to think about it. Really powerful way. I'm just all in my thoughts right now about that, right? Because I think that can apply to not only just literacy spaces, right? And like literacy assessment, but I think that can transfer in other areas in educational environments. So
yeah,
I think that's a really powerful question. That's a really powerful question. Thank you for sharing that tip. What's kind of next for you? I know you said you're in the midst of this research. Where's it going?
Well, I would, really love to expand to at some point almost like redesign an assessment that could allow for us to hear students read orally, be able to capture the power of observation as students reading, like a running record. That's what it was, designed to really, capture our observations in one space, but also open it up. What are ways that we can be thinking about the design of the actual form? There, sometimes I think like, is the design of the form almost like how it's even designed, perpetuating some thoughts that might be already there in society, about language, like wrong, right? This is an error, this, that very, like the dichotomy, which it's just not. Literacy is so complex, so much more complex than that. And so, is the design of the form, somehow, I don't know, helping us to live in an ideology that's kind of, if it's already there. And so I would love a form that would, I always say, like, if you bring your critical, culturally responsive self to a running record, then yeah, you're definitely going to bring back your analysis. But if you don't, then it's just not there. And so I would love to reimagine what that can look like, where there is a form or a way that pushes teachers to think in these ways, even if it's not, inherent in you already. To start pushing teachers to think like, I never thought about it that way. Or maybe is that what I'm seeing? And so something that just allows for complexity And so I would not, so I'm working with teachers right now in a school district in Missouri, actually, and I would love to open it up. I'm hoping to apply for a grant that will allow me to open it up to other school districts. And what I'm hoping is that we network together, almost like a design-based research where
Yeah.
we can kind of try things out as educators, working with their students and see what works, what's really working for us to move the needle here on this.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I think that's great. I love the connection and collaboration, right, with the educators that are out there and are seeing and working with students. And I just think that's going to become a really powerful tool to help shift the way we think about analyzing students' very complex literacy interactions, because learning to read itself is a very complex process. And sometimes I think we tend to sometimes try to boil things down into too much simplicity for speed, and then we lose this nuance. So I think that's a really powerful thing to be looking at.
I hope so. All the teachers I've talked to are really excited about it. And kind of what I was talking about before in that it's not like these teachers were intentionally crying.
Yeah.
They're really excited because it's like, oh, I can see how that inadvertently perpetuates the same inequalities that I know they would not want to. And so
Yes.
it's really about that being more aware, as we talked about, and then also very intentional about bringing a critical eye
Mhm.
to all of their practices, not just
Yeah.
their literacy practices.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. I think that's essential for us to make change. That criticality is going to be an essential component of that. Well, Dr. JaNiece Elzy Palmer, I want to thank you for joining me today on the podcast. It has been such a pleasure, as always, to talk
Thank
with you.
me. Thank you. Yeah, I am excited about this podcast. I think it's going to be so helpful, for so many of us that are really trying to make the changes and do the work to transform education into a system that works for all students, not just some.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Don't forget, everyone, to like, rate, subscribe, share with your friends. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Dragonfly Rising podcast. This wraps up another episode of the Dragonfly Rising podcast with me, your host, Dr. Tami Dean. Thank you so much for joining us. And remember that action is always greater than inaction. How will you use your voice today?